That's very much front and centre. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to take my first call on this Advanced Technology Institute bill to establish, as we now have just heard from the Minister, Callaghan Innovation. The sad thing about part 2 of this bill particularly is it mirrors the Minister who's just sat down, and the Chair promises a lot and delivers very little. Because while on this side of the House we're encouraged by the idea of a more strategic approach to the way that we develop RS&T, especially in the manufacturing area, this part of the bill indicates to me that the government's thinking is somewhat muddled and confused as to exactly what it's expecting Callaghan Innovation to do, and therefore I think is a very bad start for what should be a leading part of the way research and science develops in New Zealand. And the first point I want to make in that regard actually picks up something that Tracy Martin just said. I didn't serve on the select committee for this bill, so it was interesting to hear from Tracy Martin about the comment about 80% of the work being about relationships. And I think that's very important, because one of the things that this bill, in my view, and this part particularly, fails to do is understand that research is actually undertaken by people. Research actually is done by people, and those people in New Zealand particularly, yes, scientists, and those people in particular tend to emerge out of tertiary education and move into research and development. And it is that connection, Mr. Chair, that I believe is crucially missing from the functions of that are listed in Clause 13 of this bill. I know that government members of the committee have previously said, well, it's mentioned, it's referenced, it's there by talking about RS&T providers. But actually that's not good enough, Mr. Chair. In a bill like this that's establishing an important part of our research framework, we need to be much more specific. We actually need to be absolutely clear that we want this institute to work closely with tertiary education providers, and we could clearly and specifically say that in Clause 13, and there are SOPs in Megan Wood's name that go towards that. Because, Mr. Chair, in New Zealand, the development of innovation comes about often by the association of tertiary institutions, the private sector and other research providers, including CRIs, government research providers. And indeed, one of Sir Paul Callaghan's great legacies to New Zealand was the development of the MacDiarmid Institute, which was exactly that, a collaboration between a tertiary or several tertiary institutions, CRIs and private sector players. And that then spun off Magritech. And Magritech continues to this day to do exactly the thing that submitters who came and talked on this bill asked, which is to work as a pipeline, or it isn't really a pipeline actually, it's a virtuous circle of people moving through tertiary institutions, CRIs and private sector research and development organisations. Mr. Chair, my submission is that this bill is lacking in Clause 13 in particular in the functions, in being able to say it is clearly a function of Callaghan Innovation to be part of that virtuous loop of people who are moving through research and science in New Zealand. There is nothing in the functions that makes that absolutely clear to me. And if we want to leverage more out of our tertiary institutions in terms of the value of research, which I think we should do, then we need to be explicit about how that happens. And the university researchers in New Zealand can be very pleased that and there was a study done in 2010 that said $802 million worth of research is being developed in tertiary institutions in New Zealand. That's terrific. Let's leverage off that and use things like Callaghan Innovation to be the chance that takes that into the billions of dollars. Mr. Chair, before I became a Member of Parliament, my job immediately before coming in here was working for a university in New Zealand to do exactly that work, to develop research proposals in a university setting that could be developed in the private sector or with a government agency or with a CRI. And it was hard work, because there were a lot of barriers in the way of actually making sure that our tertiary institutions, our CRIs and private sector providers want to work together, or can work together. They want to, but there are barriers in the way. This has the opportunity to be the institution that breaks those barriers down, But I just don't think at the moment in Clause 13 and the functions, or indeed in other parts of the bill in terms of the stakeholder advisory group, the way that's put together, we're doing enough to say this is a collaboration. We're a small country. We're a country that needs to make the absolute best, Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Member Grant Robertson.
We're a country that needs to make the absolute best of what is a small but highly talented pool of researchers. And that is not happening sufficiently clearly to me under this bill. So, Mr. Chair, we are proposing in our supplementary order paper number 154 a number of amendments that attempt to make clear that there is a role in terms of drawing tertiary education together with this kind of proposal. And I would urge the government to support those, because our researchers do need to be able to have all the incentives in the right place to work together. There are other CRIs outside of this where we need to keep working on this. NIWA has good collaboration with a number of our universities, but could do more. The same with ESR, and it should be clearer and it should be more established that that is one of the roles. Mr. Chair, I have a genuine question for the Minister around one of the functions, and I know he alluded in part to this before. No, I haven't asked a question yet, Todd, keep up. But this is number 13, clause 13F, around allocating and administering RS&T funding. Now, my question, and obviously he's probably just trying to get an answer to my question, so that's all right. But what we're trying to do here, what I'm trying to uncover here, is whether on the extent of the allocation and administering of funding, because it will provide a muddled mandate for this institute if it is involved heavily in the allocation and administering of RS&T funding. I can see that causing problems as it works as both a provider and a funder in a sector where money is so contestable. And so this is a question for the Minister and the Chair to explain the extent of the allocation and administering of RS&T funding that will be done. Of course, the Minister may just choose to be texting to see whether the rest of his costume is finished for his moment on the Hobbit red carpet, or he could choose to pay attention to the debate. It's really up to him. Clearly, he's preferring the former at the moment, which may well reflect his commitment to RS&T generally. Mr. Chair, the other point that I just wanted to make in this particular call is again around the question of, do we have the relationships right in this bill? And I'm looking here at clause 10, the Stakeholder Advisory Group, and again in Megan Woods' SOP number 154, there are some amendments here which I think the government should take seriously. The first of those is that in clause 10.1 it says the Minister may establish an advisory group. Of course the Minister needs to establish an advisory group on this. It's vitally important to build those relationships that Tracy Martin was talking about earlier. So that should be changed to must. It must happen, because otherwise we run the risk that Callaghan Innovation may lose some of the relationships that it should have. The other part of this is the question of who should be on this advisory group. And there's comments about it being broadly representative. Well, Mr. Chair, again, that's not good enough for a piece of legislation that is establishing an important part of our research and science and technology infrastructure. There needs to be a much more direct understanding that this Parliament wants the advisory group, it wants the Callaghan Innovation generally to be linked in with the rest of the sector, to be clear that we want tertiary education involved, to be clear that we want the scientists, the employees to be involved in the advisory group. These are fairly basic parts, I would have thought, of establishing something as significant as this. But again, this bill flatters to deceive. It's got good general ideas, it's going in the right direction, but what we see here is a lack of commitment to the people who do this work, to the relationships that are important to ensuring that science and innovation flourishes in New Zealand. So, Mr. Chair, there are a number of amendments in Part 2 that I believe the government should take up, so that we actually know that the body that has been established here is properly connected into the tertiary education sector and takes real note of the fact that research doesn't just happen. It happens as a result of scientists who are trained in our tertiary institutions. We want to create a virtuous circle of people moving through tertiary education into research, out to the private sector and back in again, so that we know that New Zealand is getting the best out of this kind of science funding.
I call the Honourable Member Nikki Kay.
Mr. Chair, I'm very pleased to speak